Okay, thanks for coming. And I'd like to start out by saying I'm a cognitively limited being, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we might know about the cognitive properties of non-humans. And so I'm putting that disclaimer out there. But I want to give a little background just about some basics of moral status, the kinds of things that I'm going to be mentioning or referencing. You can think about moral status with regard to thinking about how where non-human animals fit. You can think about properties and characteristics that are intrinsic to the beings, and then you can also think about relational properties. In other words, the values that we as kind of norm makers give to the objects, right? So, for example, you might say, if I throw a brick or I throw a kitten, what's the difference? Well, there are intrinsic properties intrinsic to the kitten, like sentience that the brick doesn't have, but also that brick might be the brick that came from my house, and I have sentimental attachment, so I give it value. So those are two different kinds of valuing. But I just want to focus on the first one, number one, today. So I think one way that we think about this question, that people often think about investigating these kinds of properties in non-humans, is to think about what cognitive properties and other properties, physiological properties and capacities, do members of this particular species have, and which of those properties are morally relevant. So we can say, oh, well, dogs have paws. Is that morally relevant? And chimpanzees have certain kind of cognitive properties. Is that morally relevant? So that's one way to frame this. And that's not the way I think that we should frame the question. And I'm going to come back to my answer in just a second. I'm going to digress for a moment and talk a little bit about moral status. And that is, philosophers often distinguish between moral considerability and kind of moral significance. So think about moral considerability as being a membership into a club. It's a threshold phenomenon. So either you're morally considerable or you're not, right? You're either in the club or you're not. And that gives you a certain kind of moral standing. And what that does is it obligates moral deliberators to respect the interests of that individual. And if you're morally considerable, you can be wronged in a morally relevant sense. So basically, moral considerability is saying you're either in the club or not, and there's ways to get in the club. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But there's also the notion of moral significance. And moral significance is not so much a threshold phenomenon. It's actually more of a matter of degree. So once you're in the club, we have to have comparative judgments of moral weight. So when people say, if you're on a lifeboat and you have to throw a human or a dog over, which do you throw over, right? So those kinds of problems, those are problems of weighting and adjudicating moral differences. And those fall under the category of moral significance. So they help us adjudicate. So now when we think about moral considerability, we can ask the question, what gets you into the club, right? What gets us into that club? And there are some candidate intrinsic properties that people talk about, right? Living things, this is the kind of thing philosophers would say. Biocentrism, ecosystems are in the club. Sentience gets you into the club. Being a member of the human species gets you into the club. Personhood gets you into the club. And now none of these are kind of vague. There's no necessary and sufficient conditions for most of these. And for some people, personhood, as we'll see, there are a lot of different ways to think about it. But those are some of the candidate properties we can talk about. With moral significance, though, we can ask, do the criteria determine the moral weight? What criteria determine that? So what I wanted to say is, I think, and I'm not going to argue for it, but I think it's reasonable to say that, as Peter Singer does, of course, is that, well, the candidate intrinsic property that gets you into the club of things that are morally considerable is sentience. And I think that when people, in general, when philosophers are arguing about whether species X is a person, they're usually talking about the moral weight. The being is usually already in the club. It's an argument about what's the moral weight, right? So if the chimpanzee is determined to be a person in the normative sense, descriptively, then it has a certain moral weight, or he or she has a moral weight. So let's go back to our question. What cognitive and other properties that are intrinsic do they have, and which of them are morally relevant? So I did a little kind of a metadata study, and I came up with this chart. Speaking of following on Lori's talk about similarity, this is pretty the paradigm case of looking at similarity, right? So what I did here is I just aggregated a bunch of data. I spent months reading through different journals, and just to let you know, this stuff changes so fast, and I'm sure that by the time I finish this talk, there's some other boxes that are going to be different. But let me tell you what's going on here. And I'm just dividing, say, from like jellyfish, and we have mammal, and then over here I have some physiological and some behavioral things. So this is evidence of sentience in various genera. So the question is, here's a question people ask me. I'll say, oh, I'm a vegetarian. They'll go, oh, do you step on ants? Do you take antibiotics? Because if you do, then you're a hypocrite. And so I always thought, well, it's a good idea to figure out what feels pain. Of course, there are serious epistemological challenges to saying whether something feels pain or not, and that's part of the problem of other minds, and we're not going to solve that anytime soon. So the best thing we can do is make inferences about organisms' physiology and behavioral responses. So this is the kind of chart that I was formulating when I was thinking about this question, and these little plus signs say yes, and these minus signs say no, and a lot of it we're not sure about, but maybe yes. And so you could see, like, for example, you might say a crustacean, like, for example, a lobster. Does a lobster feel pain? And, well, they have nociceptors and nociceptor response. So it gives you an indication that if these physiological components are there that are analogous to the components in humans that also produce fire in the way that produces pain, so you can make a loose inference. But this stuff can be really important for animal welfare, and I want to point this out. So in 2002, if you look at the chart under fish, then this is what the column's going to look like. And then when Braithwaite publishes in 2003, it changes. So there's a difference in 1 year, and then that people get really interested in that because like, oh, now I think that the fish feel pain because scientists have said that they have those things like nociceptors. And when it comes to things like personhood, we can do things like this. We can talk about distress, self-recognition, self-awareness, which is different than self-recognition, and a noetic memory, which is kind of an episodic, placing yourself in time, specific emotional recognition. So these are some of the things that philosophers talk about, not specifically like this in a chart. And so in looking over the research, this is the chart I've created, and like I said, this stuff can change all the time, and we can talk about it in more detail in the question and answer period. But you can see that there are a lot of question marks here. So let me go through a brief history of kind of picking up on what Peter Singer was talking about last night with regard to philosophers and personhood. So Kant famously says the fact that the human being can have the representation I raises him infinitely above all the other beings on earth. By this he is a person, right? So the representation I, this kind of I can think, I have self-awareness. So that's very influential from Kant. And Singer says in 79 in his book, he says there, and this is not a criteria for personhood, but just things that have to be considered that give you moral significance. Anticipation, memory, knowledge of what is happening. Reagan says in 83, he gives his subject of a life thing, and he says things like a sense of the future, an emotional life with feelings of pleasure and pain, welfare interests, right? So these are the kinds of things that Reagan is saying. These are important things if we find them in these animals, right? Non-human animals. Recently, David DeGrazia says personhood involves sufficiently complex forms of consciousness, autonomy, rationality, self-awareness, linguistic competence, sociability, moral agency, and intentionality in action, right? So these are pretty stringent. If you're someone like Gary Francione, I think you're going to say, if you feel pain, you're a person. That's it. End of story. Recently, Gary Varner, he has an interesting book out, and he says that a person is basically a storyteller. That's what distinguishes, if you have to be able to tell a story. So let's go back to this. Here's what I'm saying. What about personhood as far as criteria for moral weight? So the question I had to raise today is, what might a non-chauvinistic, non-speciesist, scientifically informed, species-free ethics personhood look like? Well, I'm not going to answer that question directly. I'm just going to hint and hand-wave at some kind of solution. So what cognitive and other properties do they have, and which of them are morally relevant? I think that's not the right way to answer the question. So here's what I think. I think to have a species-free, non-speciesist formulation of some kind of ethic, we have to forget that question. That's the one most of us ask. Here's the way we have to do it. There's two parts to it. What cognitive and other properties, now I'm just talking about the intrinsic ones. I'm leaving aside the relational one. What cognitive and other properties and capacities do we, whatever a moral community, whatever that may be, find to be morally relevant? So we can figure those out first, and then we can say, where in the universe are these properties instantiated? Right? So rather than going, oh, I just found out that the chimpanzee has certain cognitive properties, and then let's confer and see, does that make that morally important? We can say, these things we find important, now let's look around the universe and see where they are. Right? So we're not talking about species in any sense. And there are some virtues of this, thinking about it this way. It's non-chauvinistic. It handles these kind of future cases, genetically modified humans, chimeras, artificial intelligence, if it ever reaches that point. And the other virtue is that if you find it a virtue, it's scientifically informed. Not that science is going to give us, as Laurie said, you're not going to get the answer of personhood from science, but you need to have some information from science to be at least informed on those aspects. And it's non-speciesist. So one of the things that was raised when I talked about this with some colleagues was that there's a guy named Brent Mishler over at Berkeley who I had a conversation with, he's an anti-realist about species. So his claim is that, and it's a movement in biology now, right, that species is actually, it's not real. It's not ontologically real. It's like race. Species is a social construct, right? And so this is supposed to be a challenge. So I'm doing these charts with lines and making all this stuff, and it turns out that species isn't real. But I don't think that's a problem because we can learn a lot from race studies, right? So we can think about species pragmatism, for example, like racial pragmatism. So scientists tell us there's no biological fact of the matter about race. So does that mean we should totally eliminate race? Some people think we do. I think that's a bad move. What we can do is say, well, we have the social construction race, but it's a reliable indicator of some things, and if we have a program of social justice, we definitely need to think about race. We can't look and see who are in our prisons, but let's not talk about race. That would not serve justice. So I think, likewise, even if it turns out that species anti-realism is true and there is no such thing in the furniture of the universe called species, we still can use species pragmatically, so it's not a knockdown objection to my kind of chart making. And the other thing that's good about species as a social construct, if it's true, if anti-realism about species is true, it further undermines essentialism. So just like with race, again, most people walking the street are racial essentialists. They think there are these biologically things that are real things called race, and attached to those biological real things are certain properties, and some of those are moral, right? And some people's races are better than others, right? And of course, that's undermined by Darwinian evolution. But I think it even helps to go further if it turns out that there is no such thing as species biologically, then our whole notion that there's the us and the other, there's humans and everything else, that starts to lose some weight. And also, it kind of emphasizes this notion of moral individualism, which I'm not going to talk about, but it's a pushback against kind of group membership, which is very common. If you ask my mom, why is it okay to eat cows and not humans? And she'll say, because they're cows. They're not in the group. That's the answer, right? So there's pushback against that. So let me get close to the end and say, what might a non-chauvinistic, non-speciesist, scientifically informed ethics look like? Okay, so here's what I think the kind of plan would be, something like this. You have this principled normative theory, and this is only part of it, right? There's intuitions and there's this kind of reflective equilibrium, wherever you fall on that. But you have some kind of theory prescribing what characteristics are morally relevant. And this is maybe under some kind of veil of ignorance. In other words, you don't say, well, the ones that are important are the ones that humans have, right? So you have to have some kind of method of deciding what you think is morally important. And like I said, in the case of a brick versus a cat, it's pretty easy. The cat feels pain, the brick doesn't. And so, pain is important, and we put that out. We wanted to be informed by biology, psychology, cognitive ethology. I think it's interesting. A lot of philosophers have done work. I'm not even going back to Descartes. I'm thinking of Donald Davidson, who famously gave an a priori argument for why animals don't think. And he had this argument, and there's all this literature and this whole data about animal minds and cognition, but he just sat in the armchair and said, they don't have language, and language requires this meta-beliefs and this whole machinery that was brought in. And so I think it's really imprudent to sit there and do armchair science without looking at the system. So we have to be, philosophers and ethicists need to be scientifically informed. Again, to echo Lori's sentiment, that's not going to provide the answer. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition for coming up with your kind of breakdown of moral terrain. And lastly, it's constituted by intrinsic properties of individuals in conjunction with kind of non-speciesist relational properties. So in other words, when you think about your ethics, you want to say, okay, these are the things that we find valuable. Here's where we find them in the universe. And then we can talk about, bring in our relational properties, or they come in together, but we make sure that they're non-speciesist. And I think that's about it. I want to end with a picture of a hero. I wish we could all be more like Henry. Okay, anyway, thank you.